We're going to talk about the penny press today, but first I want to talk a little bit about Elijah Lovejoy. So, Chapter 2 in Street Matter discusses him and other abolitionist editors, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison. Um, but this book, first of all, really intrigued me, and so I wanted to talk a little bit more about um, Lovejoy and what he was up against. So, this was Lovejoy on freedom of expression. If you give ground a single inch, there's no stopping place. I deem it therefore my duty to take my stand upon the Constitution. We have slaves, it is true, but I am not one. So Garrison was in Boston, and he was writing to an audience of like-minded people. Lovejoy, who was from New England, he had moved west and he went to St. Louis. And in St. Louis is where he started his newspaper and writing against slavery. But in St. Louis, that was pro-slavery territory. And so we've talked some about public opinion and its power. And this is a great example of how public opinion can trump the freedom of the press. So, as you'll read, Lovejoy had his presses destroyed. He finally left St. Louis, where it had been really difficult for him. He had encountered mobs, just like James Birney did in Cincinnati. This is what Birney said of the mobs in Cincinnati. A band of lawless men array themselves against the Constitution, declaring that their will and not that of the people is paramount. So Lovejoy moved to Alton, Illinois, where again he had a press destroyed, and then he ordered another press. And it wasn't just mobs that would come out. It was the mobs that would destroy the press and threaten people like Lovejoy and Birney. But it was the establishment as well. Churches spoke out against people like Lovejoy and Birney. Politicians did. They weren't necessarily the ones that went and threatened the editors or destroyed their presses, but there was a lot of public opinion, especially in a place like Cincinnati or St. Louis, both southern leaning states, even though not in the South, and then even in Alton, Illinois, which was a northern state. So public opinion was extremely strong. So Lovejoy said, I have appeared openly, and this was in St. Louis, I have appeared openly among you in your streets and marketplaces, and now I openly and publicly throw myself into your hands. I can die at my post, but I cannot desert it. So he had been threatened before. He armed himself. He had guns throughout his house. But when this press came across the river, the Mississippi River to Alton, Illinois, it was stored in a warehouse, in a friend's warehouse. And the mob heard about it, and they showed up. They were armed, and Lovejoy wasn't alone in the warehouse. There were about a dozen people there, and they were armed as well. And someone climbed up a ladder and lit the warehouse on fire. And Lovejoy came out in an attempt to stop him, and Lovejoy was armed, and he was shot to death. And he became a martyr for freedom of the press, definitely for the abolition movement. But this just shows how important the public opinion is, and that you have to take that into account for sure. So let's move on to the penny press model. So newspapers in the early 1800s were losing in popularity. Now the politicians, the politics had kind of calmed down. You didn't really need a newspaper to attack the other party on a constant basis. And newspapers became more of the product more was about business and commerce, and it was expensive. It cost like 12 cents, or it cost 6 cents, which today would be like $12. So newspapers were kind of dying out, which is ironic because we think about today newspapers dying out. But this penny press model came along in the 1830s. And the idea was that you would sell your product, news and information, for 1 cent to a mass audience. And most people could afford 1 cent for a newspaper. And then you would sell that audience to the advertisers who would pay to be in your newspapers. Again, that is the model that we have today that's kind of dying off. If you pick up a newspaper like the Seattle Times, which still has advertising, you'll see that this is just the model from the 1830s. So, yeah, it's dying off slowly, but surely as far as physical newspapers. But that model lasted for almost 200 years, which is a pretty good run. Today, the product still exists. The mass audience still exists, but they're not necessarily paying for the information. They can get it off social media. Newspapers now more than ever are starting to put up a paywall, but for a long time they didn't. And so advertising is going to social media and other places. So newspapers don't have as much advertising as they used to. And that includes online, because they just can't sell the ads like they were able to when they dominated the market. But that is the penny press model. And again, that is the penny press model that we have to this day. So what was different? What was the product that they were selling? So this is from Henry Hetherington. This is in England. His Twopenny Dispatch. It will be a repository of all the gems and treasures and fun and frolic and news occurrences of the week. It shall abound in police intelligence, in murders, rapes, suicides, burnings, maimings, theatricals, pugilism, and all manner of moving accidents by flood and field. In short, it will be stuffed with every sort of devilment that will make it sell. So again, we think about the product back then and today, and that is a lot of what we have in our news now. So we have a lot of police news. On television, if it bleeds, it leads. It's a well-known expression. That's why you see fires and shootings and things like that leading the newscasts. You have theatricals. So entertainment is very popular today. Pugilism is sports. We have that. And then we also have weather. So all of those kinds of things were set up in terms of a product during the penny press era. And initially, the penny press was stationed pretty much in New York City, because Washington back then was kind of a backwater. It was more about politics. The newspapers there were just writing about political news, not so much other things like pugilism and those kinds of things that were more appealing to a mass audience, obviously. So Benjamin Day started the New York Sun. He got it started. He was the first one, and you can read about him in the chapter that's on reserve, the penny press chapter. And he didn't necessarily always write what would be considered news. He had some fake news, including people living on the moon. And he touted it as like a real story, and a lot of people believed it. Other people would then write that it was false, but that was fine with Day, because then he'd still sell more newspapers because it would get that much more attention. The New York Herald, that was James Gordon Bennett, and he is the father of the tabloid. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of the way he did things. One of the smart things that he did was limit the amount of advertising time. So before that, if you bought an advertisement newspaper, it might last for a year. But he put a limit on it, like 2 weeks, and said you're going to have to renew it after 2 weeks. He also brought about classified advertising. And in terms of politics, he didn't pick one side. He went after everybody. And he called them, the politicians, tricksters and loafers and parasites. The New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, who was coined the term "Go West, young men," he was very involved in politics, even ran for president, but he had a very influential newspaper. And the New York Times of Henry Raymond in 1851. Of all these newspapers, of these four, the New York Times is the one that still exists to this day. So this is James Gordon Bennett talking about the kind of news product that he would want to put out. There was more journalistic money to be made in recording gossip that interested in bar rooms, workshops, race courses, and tenement houses than in consulting tastes of drawing rooms and libraries. So he was not very popular with a lot of the kinds of things that he wrote. He was also not popular with the other editors because of the way he competed against them. Um, when foreign newspapers would come in to New York City on boats, he would have people down at the wharves grabbing those newspapers up immediately so he could report the international news in his newspaper first. Even got to the point where he would send boats out to meet the ships that were coming in so he could grab that news. He put his newspapers on trains to Boston, Philadelphia, and other cities, so the Herald became the first regional newspaper. And again, as I said, he was extremely unpopular, and editors and readers often confronted him in public, and he was often in fights. One case, he and another editor engaged in a duel. They shot at each other and both missed. Someone sent him a letter bomb, but it failed to go off. And Walt Whitman, who you've probably heard of, a literary giant in the United States, he was a young writer for a competing paper at the time, and he described Bennett as a reptile making his path with slime wherever he goes, and breathing mildew at everything fresh or fragrant. Midnight ghoul, preying on rottenness and repulsive filth, a creature hated by his nearest intimates, and bearing the consciousness thereof up his distorted features and upon his despicable soul. One whom good men avoid as a blot to his nature, whom all despise and whom no one blesses. All this is James Gordon Bennett. So again, the father of the tabloid, when we think about the kind of news that we see sometimes, spectacular, sensational news, really Bennett was kind of the father of that. We'll talk a little bit about him more as time goes on if we have a chance.